I found the photograph on a Sunday afternoon in September, 13 months after I buried my husband. It was tucked inside a wedding album I had not opened in years. Not our album. Not the white leather book with the gold lettering that still sat on the shelf in the living room. This was a different album. Smaller. Dark blue cover, no label, pushed to the back of a box I had been avoiding since February. I opened it without knowing what it was. The first page was a wedding photograph. Thomas was in it. He was young the way he looked in the early years of our marriage, before gray came into his hair, and before time settled into the lines around his eyes. He was wearing a dark suit. He was smiling. The woman beside him was not me. She was in a white dress, holding flowers, standing at the altar of a church I had never seen. Her hand was in Thomas's. His eyes were on her face with the particular expression of a man who believes completely in the moment he is standing in. On the back of the photograph, written in Thomas's handwriting, was a date. 2 years after our wedding. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. Thomas was my husband for 38 years. He died 14 months ago, cardiac arrest, sudden, a Tuesday morning in February that reorganized everything that came before it and everything that came after. I thought, by September, that I understood the shape of what he had been. I was wrong. Again. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me what city you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the woman in the white dress. The box had been sitting in the spare bedroom since February. I had moved it there from the closet in the first week after the funeral, when Lucas and Lindsay had come to help me begin the process of sorting through Thomas's things, and I had discovered, almost immediately, that I was not ready to sort through Thomas's things. I could manage certain categories. The suits went relatively quickly, once I had decided they were going to the men's shelter downtown, and not to a consignment store where I might one day pass the window and see Thomas's gray herringbone on a stranger. The books took longer. His books had opinions, annotations in the margins, passages underlined with the particular deliberateness of a man who read in order to remember. I kept those. But the boxes from the back of the study closet, 4 of them, sealed with tape, labeled in Thomas's handwriting with dates rather than contents. Those I had carried to the spare bedroom and stacked against the wall, and not touched since. The labels said things like 1987 to 1992 and documents, personal and pre-merger files. The kind of labels that suggest filing systems and professional organization, and nothing that requires urgent attention. The kind of labels Thomas would have put on things he wanted handled carefully and without hurry. I had been honoring that without meaning to. Thomas and I had been married in June of 1986. I have told the story of how we met enough times that it has acquired the particular polish of a story that has been told well for decades. The graduate school library in Boston. The 3 weeks he sat across from me before speaking. The first words he said about the way I treated my books. I told it at dinner parties and anniversary celebrations, and once, memorably, at Lucas's rehearsal dinner when the best man asked if anyone wanted to share how love begins. The story was true. All of it was true. I have had to remind myself of that repeatedly in the months since February, because when you discover that a person was not entirely what you believed them to be, the temptation is to retroactively unmake everything. To decide that if the ending was false, then the beginning must have been false too. It doesn't work that way. I know that now. The beginning was real. The 38 years were real, or most of them were, in the ways that mattered most. Thomas had been a family law attorney. Estate planning, property disputes, the documentation of people's most important decisions. He was good at his work and respected in his profession, and came home every evening by 6:30, with the particular relieved quality of a man who is genuinely glad to be home. He asked about my day. He remembered what I had told him the previous week. He noticed when I was tired before I said I was tired. We raised Lucas in the house on Birchwood Lane. We took vacations to places Thomas had researched thoroughly, always with printed itineraries and restaurant reservations made weeks in advance, because Thomas approached travel the way he approached everything, with preparation and with care. We had dinner parties on Saturday nights twice a month for 30 years. We had arguments and reconciliations, and the particular comfortable silence of people who have lived alongside each other long enough that silence no longer requires explanation. It was a good marriage. I believe that still. I have to believe it still, because the alternative, that 38 years were simply a sustained performance, requires a coldness I am not willing to assign to a man I knew as well as I knew Thomas. He was not cold. Whatever else he was not cold. But he had a box in the back of his study closet. A dark blue album with no label. And a photograph I had never seen. I had begun, by September, to believe that the worst of the discoveries were behind me. This is something I have noticed about the way grief and revelation interact. They both create the illusion of completion. You reach a certain point of understanding and the mind, exhausted and desperate for rest, begins to believe that it has now accounted for everything, that the full picture has been assembled, that what remains is simply the long, slow work of adjustment. The storage unit had felt like that. The voicemail had felt like that. Each time I had found something I had experienced a period, afterward, of believing that the inventory was now complete, that Thomas's hidden life had been fully mapped, that Patricia and Sandra and the federal investigators between them had located every account and every name and every piece of documentation that existed. 13 months in, I was sleeping better. I was eating regularly. I had established a routine in the new house, mornings in the garden, afternoons at my desk handling the ongoing correspondence related to the civil recovery, evenings reading or talking to Lucas on the phone or exchanging messages with Ruth or Catherine or Margaret through the group thread that had become one of the more unexpected constants of my new life. I was, by any reasonable measure, functioning. More than functioning. Beginning, in small careful increments, to rebuild. Then I decided to go through the boxes. It was a Sunday. The particular quality of a Sunday in September in Connecticut. Warm still, but with the first suggestion of something cooler underneath. The light starting to come at a different angle. The garden beginning its slow retreat. I had been meaning to address the boxes for months. Patricia had mentioned twice that completing the inventory of Thomas's personal documents would be useful for the final stages of the estate process. I made coffee. I carried it to the spare bedroom. I opened the door and looked at the 4 boxes stacked against the wall, and decided that today was the day. The first two boxes were exactly what the labels suggested. Files from Thomas's early years at the firm. Case notes, correspondence, the administrative residue of a legal career that had spanned 3 decades. I went through them methodically, setting aside anything that seemed potentially relevant to Patricia and recycling the rest. It took most of the morning. The third box was labeled pre-merger files and contained more of the same, documentation from a firm acquisition in the mid-90s that Thomas had been involved in, dense with legal language that I worked through carefully and found nothing unexpected in. The fourth box had a date label, 1987 to 1992. I opened it expecting more files. On top was a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Beneath it, wrapped in a brown paper bag that had been taped shut and then opened and taped again, was the dark blue album. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a single document. A marriage certificate. Thomas Allen Brooks. And a name I had never heard. Vivian Claire Marsh. Married October 14, 1988. 2 years and 4 months after our wedding in my parents' backyard in Hartford. I set the envelope down. I unwrapped the album. The album contained 43 photographs. I know the exact number because I counted them twice, sitting on the floor of the spare bedroom with my back against the wall and my coffee gone cold on the windowsill, going through each one with the methodical attention of a woman who has learned, over the past 13 months, that the only reliable way to handle the unbearable is to treat it as information. They were wedding photographs. A full set, professionally taken, the kind of documentation that someone had paid for and organized and kept with intention. Not snapshots. Not casual records. A complete visual account of a wedding day, arranged chronologically from the ceremony through the reception. The same way our own wedding album had been arranged. The same way people arrange these things when they intend the record to last. Thomas appeared in 31 of the 43 photographs. In the ceremony photographs, he was at the altar of a church I didn't recognize, stone interior, tall windows. The particular quality of light that comes through old glass on a clear October day. He was in a dark suit, not a tuxedo, which was consistent with his aesthetic. Thomas had always found tuxedos excessive, had worn a dark suit to our own wedding for the same reason. In the reception photographs, he was at tables with people I had never seen, laughing with a man who appeared to be a best man or groomsman, dancing with the woman in the white dress, cutting a cake that had pale flowers on it. In 3 of the photographs, he was looking directly at the camera, with the expression of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. I recognized that expression. I had seen it in our own wedding photographs. The woman's name was Vivian Claire Marsh. I had her name from the marriage certificate. I had her face from 43 photographs. What I did not have, sitting on the floor of the spare bedroom on a Sunday afternoon in September, was any context whatsoever for how she existed, how long she had existed in Thomas's life, or what had become of her. The marriage certificate gave me a date, October 1988, and a location. A county clerk's office in western Massachusetts. Not Connecticut. Not anywhere near where Thomas and I had been living at the time, which was an apartment in Hartford where we had moved after our own wedding while Thomas finished his law degree and I began teaching at a secondary school nearby. October 1988. Lucas had been born in March of that year. Thomas had married another woman 7 months after our son was born. I sat with that specific fact for a long time before I was able to move past it. The manila envelope contained more than the marriage certificate. I had set it aside after the first document and not returned to it immediately. I needed time between pieces of information. I had learned that about myself in the past year. There is a rate at which revelation can be absorbed, and beyond that rate the information stops being processable and becomes simply noise, a roar of fact without meaning. I had learned to pace myself, to take what I could hold and set the rest down temporarily. After perhaps 20 minutes, I picked the envelope up again. Behind the marriage certificate were 4 additional documents. The first was a lease agreement. An apartment in Springfield, Massachusetts. Signed by Thomas Allen Brooks and Vivian Claire Brooks. She had taken his name, dated January 1989, 3 months after the wedding. The second was a utility bill from the same address, dated June 1990. The third was a photograph, not a wedding photograph but a casual one, printed at home the way the others in the storage unit had been printed. Thomas and Vivian, sitting at a kitchen table I didn't recognize. Between them, on the table, a child's drawing in crayon. Thomas was pointing at something in the drawing and laughing. Vivian was looking at him with an expression I recognized immediately and wished I didn't. I turned the photograph over. Thomas's handwriting. A single line. Sophie. Age 3. March 1991. A child. Thomas had had a child. I put the photograph face down on the floor beside me and looked at the wall for a long time. Sophie would be 34 years old now. That was the calculation I made sitting on the floor of my spare bedroom. Automatic, unbidden, the way the mind produces facts when it is trying to establish the coordinates of something too large to comprehend all at once. 34 years old. Approximately Lucas's age. A woman now, if she was still alive, living somewhere I didn't know with a history I hadn't known existed. A daughter Thomas had never mentioned. Not once. Not in 38 years of marriage, of dinner conversations, of the particular intimacy of people who share a bed and a life and the accumulated weight of decades. Not when Lucas was born and Thomas held his son for the first time with an expression I had always understood as the expression of a man experiencing fatherhood for the first time. Not when Lucas graduated, married, had children of his own. Not in any of the thousands of conversations about family and legacy and what we were leaving behind. Not once. I picked up my phone. I did not call Patricia. Not yet. Patricia was for when I had assembled enough information to present coherently. This was not that moment. This was the moment before that moment, the raw, unprocessed moment of finding, and what I needed for that moment was not a lawyer. I called Ruth. Ruth Calloway, retired schoolteacher from Providence, one of the 5 women connected to Thomas's hidden life, the woman whose voicemail had started the second chapter of my discoveries. Ruth, who had texted one morning, "I learned something important about who I am when nobody is watching." Ruth, who had gone back to the grief support group where Thomas had found her and was now using what she knew to protect people who didn't yet know what she knew. She answered on the second ring. "Eleanor. I found something," I said. "In a box in the spare bedroom." A brief silence. Ruth had learned, over the months of our acquaintance, not to ask if I was all right when I called like this. She understood that all right was not the relevant question. "Tell me," she said. I told her about the album. The 43 photographs. The marriage certificate. October 1988. The child in the photograph with the crayon drawing. Sophie, age 3, March 1991. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "He was married to her at the same time he was married to you," she said. It was not a question. She was simply stating the architecture of it. The way you repeat a fact back, when you need to hear it said plainly. "Yes," I said. "For how long?" "I don't know yet. The most recent document in the envelope is from 1990. There may be more in the box. I haven't finished going through it." Eleanor. Ruth's voice was steady and careful. "Do you want me to come?" I looked at the album on the floor. The 43 photographs. Thomas laughing at a kitchen table with a child between them who was 34 years old now and didn't know, presumably, that she had a brother named Lucas and 2 nieces or nephews and a stepmother who was sitting on a spare bedroom floor in Connecticut finding out she existed for the first time. "Not today," I said. "Let me finish the box first. I'll call you when I know more." "I'll be here," Ruth said. "All day. Call me whenever." I set the phone down. I reached back into the envelope. The 4th document was a divorce decree. Thomas Allen Brooks and Vivian Claire Brooks, dissolved October 3, 1994. 6 years of marriage. Ending 8 years after our wedding. When Lucas was 6 years old and had just started primary school, and Thomas was coming home every evening by 6:30 and asking about my day and giving no indication whatsoever that he had spent the previous 6 years simultaneously married to another woman in a different city. The divorce was uncontested. No listed reason. The settlement was minimal. The apartment lease had ended 2 years prior. There was no shared property of significance. There was a child custody arrangement referenced in the decree, but not detailed in the document itself. Custody arrangement. Thomas had had a custody arrangement for a daughter named Sophie, and had maintained it, or not maintained it. I had no way of knowing yet for years without ever mentioning it to anyone in his Connecticut life. I sat with the divorce decree for a long time. Then I went back to the box. Beneath the manila envelope were 6 more items. 3 birthday cards. Handmade ones, the kind a child makes at school, with uneven lettering and crayon drawings on the cover. Each one signed "Love Sophie" in the careful, oversized printing of a young child learning to form letters. The first was dated 1992, Sophie would have been 4. The last was dated 1995, the year after the divorce, when Sophie would have been 7. After 1995, nothing. No more cards. No more photographs. No more documents connecting Thomas to a daughter named Sophie or a woman named Vivian. Whatever had happened between Thomas and his first family in 1995 or shortly after had severed the documentation entirely. The record simply stopped. I looked at the 3 birthday cards lined up on the floor beside me. Made by a child. Kept by a father. Stored in a box in the back of a study closet for nearly 30 years, behind file labels that said nothing about what was actually inside them. He had kept them. That was the thing I kept returning to. He had kept them for 3 decades, through 4 house moves, through the accumulated weight of a life he was building on top of and around, and apparently instead of the one he had briefly had with Vivian and Sophie. He had not destroyed them. He had not discarded them. He had kept them in a box he had labeled with a date range and stored in the back of a closet. I did not know what to do with that. I still don't, entirely. There is a version of it that suggests guilt, the preservation of evidence of something he couldn't forgive himself for. There is another version that suggests something closer to grief, the keeping of a record from a part of a life that had been lost. Both versions require a more complicated understanding of Thomas than the one I had been building, which was already considerably more complicated than the one I had started with 14 months ago. I called Patricia the following morning. I had spent the remainder of Sunday and most of Sunday evening going through the rest of the box, which contained nothing further related to Vivian or Sophie, only the professional files the label had suggested. Dense with legal correspondence from the early 90s that I went through carefully and found unremarkable. Then I had made dinner. I had eaten it at the kitchen table. I had called Lucas and talked for 20 minutes about his week and his children and a film he had seen, and had not mentioned the album or the marriage certificate because I was not yet ready to introduce this particular information into that particular relationship without understanding it more fully first. Then I had slept. Not well, but adequately. The sleep of a woman who has learned to separate the processing from the resting, to set the information down at a designated hour, and allow the body its requirements regardless of what the mind is doing. Patricia listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "A bigamous marriage." "Yes. Legally void from the beginning," she said. "You were married first. The 1988 marriage had no legal standing." "I understand that. That's not what concerns me." "What concerns you?" I looked at the 3 birthday cards lined up on my kitchen table where I had carried them the night before. "Sophie," I said. "She's 34 years old. She may not know anything about this. She may not know her father is dead. She may not know she has a brother. She may have spent 30 years believing her father simply disappeared from her life after the divorce and never looked back." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," she said carefully. Finding her would open a significant number of questions. "I know. It would also potentially open legal questions related to the estate. If she can establish a parental relationship, even an informal one, there may be grounds for a claim." "I know that too," I said. "Find her anyway." A pause. "Are you certain?" I looked at the birthday card on top of the stack. A crayon drawing of what appeared to be a house, or possibly a dog. The draftsmanship of a 4-year-old is optimistic in its ambitions. In the bottom right corner, in the oversized careful printing of a child who has just learned how letters work. "Love, Sophie. She deserves to know her father is dead," I said. "Whatever he was, whatever he did, she deserves to know. Find her." "I'll start today," Patricia said. Patricia found her in 11 days. Sophie Marsh, she had taken her mother's name, which I noted without surprise, was 34 years old and lived in Portland, Oregon. She was a landscape architect, which produced in me a small complicated feeling when I remembered that Diane, one of Thomas's 4 other women, was also a landscape architect, and that Thomas had apparently had a type that extended beyond physical appearance into professional inclination. She was unmarried. No children. She worked for a firm that specialized in urban green space design. Her professional profile was on the firm's website, a clear photograph, a brief biography, a list of completed projects. I looked at her photograph for a long time. She had Thomas's eyes. Not the color, her eyes were darker than his. But the shape, the particular set of them, the slight downward angle at the outer corners that had given Thomas's face its characteristic expression of thoughtful attention. I had looked into those eyes across a dinner table for 38 years. I recognized them in a stranger's face on a professional website in Portland, Oregon, immediately and without question. Thomas's daughter. Lucas's half-sister. A woman who had grown up, as best Patricia could determine from the public record, without a father. Vivian had remarried in 1997 and Sophie had taken her stepfather's surname, which suggested a deliberate distance from the Thomas chapter of her history. She had been 4 years old the last time her father sent a birthday card. She was 34 now. Patricia had found a contact email through the firm's website and had drafted an initial message, careful, minimal, identifying herself as handling matters related to the estate of a Thomas Allen Brooks and asking if Sophie would be willing to speak with her. "Before you send it," I said. "I want to write it." Patricia paused. "Eleanor. She deserves to hear from a person," I said. "Not a law firm. Not a form letter about an estate. A person." A long pause. "All right," Patricia said. "Write it. Send it to me first. I'll review it, and we'll send it from a neutral address." I sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours that evening. I wrote 11 drafts. The 12th was 4 sentences long. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was married to a man named Thomas Brooks for 38 years. I recently discovered documents that suggest he was also your father. I would very much like to speak with you, when and if you are ready, about who he was and what I have learned. I am sorry for everything this letter implies. I sent it to Patricia. She sent it the following morning. Sophie replied in 3 days. Not to Patricia's neutral address. She had found Eleanor's personal email. A landscape architect who designs urban spaces for a living understands how to locate information when she needs it. And she wrote directly, which told me something about her immediately. She was not a woman who worked through intermediaries when she could work directly. That, too, felt familiar in a way I noted and set aside. The email was 9 sentences long. She wrote that she had received the message, that she had spent 3 days deciding whether to respond, that she had spoken with her mother, who had told her things she had not previously known, that she was not surprised her father was dead, which she said she was aware was a difficult sentence to read and sent anyway, because she had decided that honesty was the only viable approach to whatever this was. She wrote that she had last seen her father when she was 4 years old. She wrote that she had one question before she agreed to speak with anyone, and that her willingness to continue depended entirely on the answer. Did he ever ask about me? I read that sentence 4 times. Then I looked at the 3 birthday cards in the folder on my desk. Made by a child. Kept by a father for 30 years. Moved through 4 houses. stored in a box behind file labels that said nothing about what was actually inside. I wrote back immediately. Yes. He kept every card you ever sent him. I found them in a box he had labeled and stored for 30 years. They were the first things I picked up. Her response came 40 minutes later. 2 words. Call me. I called her that evening at 7 o'clock Connecticut time, which was 4 o'clock in Portland. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was Thomas's voice in the lower registers, not identical, not obviously so, but carrying the same particular quality of careful attention. The same slight pause before speaking that Thomas had always had. The habit of a person who thinks before they commit to words. We did not begin with pleasantries. Neither of us was built for pleasantries in this context, and we both seemed to understand that immediately. My mother told me he was already married when he married her, Sophie said. She said she didn't find out until after I was born. She said when she found out she tried to leave immediately, but he made it difficult. For a while. I absorbed this. How long did she know? I said. She found out when I was about 18 months old. She said a woman came to the apartment. She didn't say who. She said the woman was very calm and simply told her the facts and left. A pause. I always thought that took courage. To just go and tell someone the truth and then leave. I thought about what it would have taken to be that woman. To find out about a second family and drive to a different city and knock on a door and tell the truth and leave. I did not know who she was. Possibly I never would. After the divorce, I said. He stopped contact. When I was 4, she said. He sent a birthday card. Then nothing. My mother said he tried to reach out once, when I was about 8. But she didn't. She decided it wasn't good for me to have someone in my life who came and went. I agreed with her. I still do. That was the right decision, I said. I know. A pause. He was paying child support. Through a lawyer, never directly. It stopped when I turned 18. My mother said she never wanted his money, but she needed it, so she took it. I made a note. Thomas had been paying child support for a daughter in Portland through a lawyer for 14 years. Another account, another arrangement, another carefully managed financial thread that had existed in his hidden life. I would tell Patricia in the morning. Sophie, I said. I need to tell you some things about your father that are going to be difficult to hear. And I want to tell you before you hear them from someone else, because you deserve to hear them from a person who knew him. A pause. Is it worse than what I already know? She said. I considered the question honestly. Yes, I said. Some of it. A long silence. All right, she said. Tell me. I told her everything. Not all at once. We spoke for 2 hours that first evening and then again the following night and again 2 days after that. 3 conversations that moved through the full geography of what Thomas had been, what he had done, and what the past 14 months had uncovered. I told her about the storage unit and the false passport. The 4 women and their document boxes. Gerald Whitmore and the financial fraud. Lindsay and the 19 months she had known. The account named James Eleanor Brooks and what it suggested about Thomas's complicated internal accounting of his own behavior. Sophie listened. She asked precise questions at precise moments, not interrupting, but navigating, directing the conversation with the focused attention of a woman who processes information by understanding its structure. She was, I noted, very good at this. The quality that in Thomas had served a legal career was doing something different in his daughter, but it was recognizably the same quality. He had a type, she said at one point, during the second conversation when I was describing the four women, their ages, their situations, their particular vulnerabilities. Yes, I said. Widows. Women alone. Women who needed someone to pay careful attention to them. Yes. A pause. My mother was 26 when she met him, Sophie said. Her own father had just died. She was working 2 jobs. She said he was the first person in years who actually listened to her. The same story. Different city, different decade, same story. A man who had mastered the particular art of making a woman feel completely seen, and who had deployed that art repeatedly, systematically, across decades and distances, in the service of something I still did not entirely understand. Did you love him? Sophie asked. Not accusingly. Simply. I thought about it for a moment. Yes, I said. The man I believed he was. I loved him completely and without reservation for a very long time. My mother did too, Sophie said. She doesn't talk about it much. But I think she did. We sat with that for a moment. Then Sophie said something I hadn't expected. I want to meet Lucas. I was quiet. He's my brother, she said. Half-brother. Whatever the precise term is. He exists. I exist. That's not nothing. No, I said. It isn't. Does he know about me yet? Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Will you tell him? I looked at the birthday cards in the folder on my desk. A crayon house or possibly a dog. Love, Sophie. Yes, I said. When you're ready for me to. A pause. I'm ready, she said. I called Lucas the following evening. He answered with the careful warmth he had developed toward me over the past 14 months, not the reflexive warmth of before, but something more deliberate. The warmth of a man who has decided consciously to stay present with his mother rather than simply assuming that presence. Mom, how are you doing? I need to tell you something, I said. And I need you to sit down first. A pause. The sound of a chair. I'm sitting, he said. I told him about the box. The album. The marriage certificate dated October 1988. The photograph of a child named Sophie, age 3, with a crayon drawing between her and a father who had kept the birthday cards she made him for 30 years. Lucas was silent for a long time. He was married to someone else, he said finally. Not a question. Processing. Before the divorce in 1994, yes. When I was born. Yes. Another long silence. I have a sister, he said. A half-sister. Yes. Is she? He stopped. Started again. Does she want to? She asked about you specifically, I said. She said she wants to meet you. The sound on the line changed. A quality of breath that I recognized as my son, not crying, but being very close to it, and managing it the way Brooks' men apparently managed things. By going very still, and very quiet, and waiting for the moment to pass. Mom, he said finally. His voice was steady. Carefully steady. How many more boxes are there? I looked at the spare bedroom door down the hall. I don't know, I said honestly. But I'm going to find out. Patricia's first response to the information about Sophie was practical and immediate, which was why I had called her the morning after my first conversation with Sophie rather than waiting until I had more to report. The child support payments, she said. Through a lawyer for 14 years. We need to find that account. I assumed you would say that. Do you have any information about the lawyer? A name, a firm, anything Sophie mentioned. She said it came through a lawyer, but she doesn't know the details. Her mother handled it. She said she could ask. Ask her today if possible. The payments would have come from somewhere, another account, another name, another set of transfers that the investigators haven't traced yet. If Thomas was maintaining a financial arrangement for 14 years that we don't know about, there may be other arrangements we also don't know about. I had thought of that. I had been thinking of it since Sophie said the words child support. Through a lawyer, 14 years. Thomas had been extraordinarily thorough. In every other area of his hidden life he had documented everything, maintained careful records, built systems that were designed to be durable and difficult to detect simultaneously. It was not plausible that the Sophie arrangement existed in isolation. Systems built by men like Thomas do not have isolated components. They have architecture. I'll call Sophie this morning, I said. Good. And Eleanor, Patricia paused in the particular way she paused when she was about to say something she had been considering carefully. Prepare yourself for the possibility that what we find may be larger than what we currently understand. I've been preparing for that for 14 months, I said. I know. I'm saying it anyway. Sophie called her mother that morning and called me back within 2 hours. Vivian Marsh, she had returned to her maiden name after her second marriage ended, was 61 years old, and lived in western Massachusetts, not far from the county clerk's office where she had married Thomas in October 1988. Sophie said her mother had been reluctant to discuss it initially, that 35 years of distance had not made the subject easier, but had simply made it older, which is a different thing. Eventually Vivian had given Sophie a name. The lawyer Thomas had used for the child support arrangement was a man named Robert Calloway. I wrote the name down and looked at it. Then I looked at it again. Calloway. Ruth Calloway. The retired schoolteacher from Providence whose voicemail had been the 11th message on Thomas's second phone. The woman Thomas had met at a grief support group and called David. I called Patricia immediately. Robert Calloway, I said. I need to know if he is related to a Ruth Calloway in Providence, Rhode Island. A brief silence. How certain are you that this is connected? Patricia said. I'm not certain of anything, I said. I'm asking you to find out. Sandra had the answer by the following afternoon. Robert Calloway was Ruth Calloway's late husband. He had died 4 years ago, the death that had brought Ruth to the grief support group where Thomas had found her, introduced himself as David, and spent the next 3 years carefully constructing a relationship built on the shared language of loss. Robert Calloway had handled the child support arrangement for Thomas and Vivian since 1994. 30 years of professional involvement with Thomas's hidden life. He had died without ever telling his wife that the man she would one day meet at a grief support group and believe was a kind widower named David, was the same man he had been managing a child support arrangement for since before Ruth and Robert's own children were born. I sat in Patricia's conference room and looked at Sandra's laptop screen and thought about the layers. Thomas had used Ruth's dead husband's professional services for 30 years. Had attended his funeral, possibly, we didn't know that yet, but Patricia was finding out. Had then found Ruth at the grief support group for Robert's death and introduced himself under a false name and built a relationship with the widow of the man who had managed his secrets. Whether that was calculated or coincidental, I could not determine. I had stopped being certain which category Thomas's actions fell into. Some of what he did looked like calculation, and some of it looked like the accumulation of a life that had become too complex to manage, and that he had stopped trying to separate from itself. "Does Ruth know?" I said. "Not yet," Patricia said. "I need to call her before anyone else does." Ruth answered on the second ring, as she always did. I had learned, in the months of our acquaintance, that Ruth Calloway was a woman who answered her phone because she had decided that being available was a form of respect for the people who might be calling. She had told me this once, simply, without making a virtue of it. It was simply how she operated. "Eleanor," she said. "Ruth, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult." A pause. "All right." I told her. About the box. The album. Sophie. The child support arrangement. Robert Calloway's name on the lawyer's documentation. The silence that followed was the longest Ruth had ever allowed in our conversations. Ruth was not a woman who left silences unfilled unnecessarily. This one she left for almost a full minute. "Robert knew," she said finally. "For 30 years, yes. Based on what we've found." Another silence. Shorter this time. "He never told me," she said. Not with anger. With something more complicated than anger. The particular quality of a person recalibrating their understanding of a marriage they had believed they understood completely. I recognized that quality. I had been living inside it for 14 months. "No," I said. "He didn't." "And then Thomas came to the grief group," she said slowly, working through it as she spoke. "After Robert died. Introduced himself as David." A pause. "He knew who I was. He sought me out specifically." "We don't know that with certainty," I said. "Eleanor." Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. "We both know Thomas well enough by now to assess probability." She was right. We did. "I'm sorry, Ruth," I said. "Don't be sorry for things that aren't yours," she said. It was something she had said to me before, early in our acquaintance, when I had apologized for Thomas's actions toward her. She had corrected me then, and she was correcting me now with the same patient precision. "This is not yours to apologize for." "All right," I said. "Is Sophie well?" Ruth said after a moment. The question surprised me. Then it didn't. "She's managing," I said. "She's a strong woman." "Of course she is," Ruth said quietly. "She had to be." The investigators found Robert Calloway's records within 3 weeks. He had been meticulous. 30 years of documentation, maintained in a private filing system separate from his official firm records, stored in a manner that suggested he had always understood that this particular arrangement existed in a space that required careful separation from his professional life. He had not participated in the financial fraud. His role had been limited to the child support arrangement, which was legal in itself, and to the general knowledge of Thomas's situation, which was morally compromising but not criminally actionable. He was dead. The law, as Patricia had said about Thomas, does not reach the dead. What his records did provide was something the investigators had not yet had: a complete timeline of Thomas's financial arrangements stretching back 30 years rather than 7. Combined with Gerald Whitmore's testimony and the documentation from the 5 women's boxes and the storage unit, the picture that emerged was now genuinely complete in a way it had not been before. The total amount Thomas had moved over 30 years, not 7, not 9, but 30, was significantly larger than anything we had previously calculated. Patricia told me the number on a Thursday morning. I wrote it down. I looked at it. I put the paper face down on the conference table. How much of it is recoverable? I said. A meaningful portion, Patricia said carefully. Not all of it. Some of the older transfers are beyond the statute of limitations. Some moved through channels that are now closed. But the more recent activity, the past 7 to 10 years, is well documented and recoverable through the civil process. And Sophie's child support, I said. The arrangement Thomas maintained for 14 years. Does she have a claim? Patricia considered. That is a question for Sophie's own attorney to evaluate, she said. I can recommend someone good in Portland. Her situation is distinct from yours and from the other women's. She is a biological child, not a romantic partner, which creates different legal standing. There may be estate claims available to her that weren't available to the others. Make the recommendation, I said. Today. Sophie flew to Connecticut in November. We had agreed, over the course of our telephone conversations, that meeting in person was necessary and that the meeting should happen at a time and in a place where neither of us felt at a disadvantage. She chose to come to me rather than have me come to Portland, which she said was because she wanted to see the place where he had lived, the landscape of the life she had not been part of. I picked her up at the airport on a gray November morning. I recognized her immediately in the arrivals hall. The eyes. Thomas's eyes in a stranger's face, looking around the terminal with the calm, focused attention of a woman who is navigating an unfamiliar situation by observing it carefully before committing to a response. She saw me at the same moment. We stood looking at each other for a moment in the middle of the arrivals hall with people moving around us, in both directions. Then she said, "You look like someone who has been through something." "So do you," I said. She almost smiled. Fair enough. We drove to the new house. I had made coffee and there was food I had prepared the night before with the particular nervous care of someone who understands that hospitality is a form of communication. Sophie ate and drank and looked around the kitchen with the assessing eye of a landscape architect evaluating a space. "This is nice," she said. "It feels like yours." "It is," I said. "That's relatively new." She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. Lucas came the following afternoon. I had told him Sophie was arriving and asked if he wanted to meet her during her visit. He had said yes without hesitating, which I noted and was grateful for. The version of Lucas that existed now, the one shaped by 14 months of revelation and divorce and therapy, and the conscious decision to be more honest than his father had been, was capable of walking toward difficult things rather than away from them. He arrived at 2 o'clock. Sophie was in the garden when he pulled up, standing near the far fence looking at the structure of the bare November beds with the professional attention she brought to everything. I watched from the kitchen window as Lucas got out of his car and stood for a moment looking at her. Then he walked across the garden. She turned when she heard him. They stood about 6 feet apart and looked at each other the way people look at each other when they are trying to locate something familiar in a stranger's face. I could not hear what they said. I had decided not to be in the garden for the first minutes of it. That meeting belonged to them. What I saw, from the kitchen window, was this. Lucas said something. Sophie responded. Lucas nodded slowly. Sophie looked at the garden bed nearest her and said something else, pointing at the structure of it, and Lucas looked at what she was pointing at and said something that made her almost smile. The same almost smile she had produced at the airport. They stood together in the garden for 20 minutes before coming inside. When they came through the kitchen door, they were not close yet. They were strangers who had just discovered they were family, which is its own careful category, but they were talking directly, in the manner of two people who have both recently learned that straightforwardness is the only viable option. I poured coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. Outside the window, the November garden was bare and structural, and waiting for whatever came next. The civil recovery completed in stages through the winter and into the following spring. Assets returned incrementally through the grinding patient work of legal process. The older accounts, the ones beyond the statute of limitations, were gone. That money had moved too long ago through channels too thoroughly closed to recover. Patricia had been honest about that from the beginning, and I had accepted it, because accepting what cannot be changed is one of the first skills grief teaches and the most durable. What came back was enough. More than enough to sustain the life I was building, to fund the remainder of it without the particular anxiety of a woman alone and uncertain. Thomas had been thorough in his theft and thorough in his provisions simultaneously, which was a contradiction I had stopped trying to resolve and simply accepted as the nature of the man. Gerald Whitmore completed his sentence and was released in the spring. His license was not reinstated. His firm had dissolved in his absence. He was 62 years old and would spend whatever remained of his professional life outside the profession that had defined it, which Patricia said was the appropriate consequence for a man who had spent 11 years helping another man steal from his wife. Lindsay remained 3 states away. Lucas mentioned her occasionally and briefly, in the manner of someone fulfilling a factual obligation without dwelling in it. The children saw her on the schedule the divorce agreement specified. Lucas did not speak about how that felt, and I did not ask, because some griefs belong to the person carrying them, and the most useful thing another person can do is simply be present at the edges of them without requiring explanation. Sophie returned to Portland after her November visit with Lucas's phone number saved in her contacts and a standing invitation to come back whenever she wanted. She texted 2 days after she got home. The garden is good. The bones of it are good. In the spring it's going to be something. I read the message 3 times. Then I wrote back. I think so too. It is April again. The 2nd April since Thomas died. The 2nd time this particular light has come through the kitchen window at this particular angle. landing on the table where I sit in the mornings with my coffee before the day properly begins. Last April I was still in the first year of it, still in the part where everything was raw and provisional, and the future felt like a place I wasn't sure I had permission to enter. This April is different. Not easier exactly. More settled. The way a landscape settles after significant weather, not unchanged, not restored to what it was before, but arrived at a new configuration that has its own integrity, its own structure, its own logic. The garden is coming back. Sophie was right about the bones of it. I didn't know what I was doing when I started it. I had never gardened seriously in my life, had always admired other people's gardens with the appreciation of someone who understood the result without understanding the process. But I have learned, over the past year, that not knowing what you are doing is not a reason to stop. It is simply the beginning of learning. The tulips came up last week. I did not plant them. They were there when I moved in, buried under the surface of a garden that had been left to its own devices for a season. And they came up anyway in the particular determined way of things that have been waiting for the right conditions. I stood in the garden on the morning they appeared and felt something I have been practicing how to feel again. Simple pleasure. Uncomplicated. Not earned by surviving something or achieved through effort. Just there, in the morning light, in the red and yellow of flowers that had been waiting underground all winter for the moment to be flowers. Sophie comes every other month now. She stays for a weekend, and we work in the garden on Saturday mornings while Lucas brings the grandchildren in the afternoon. And the four of us, 5, when Ruth drives down from Providence, which she has done twice, sit around my kitchen table in a configuration that would have been entirely unimaginable 2 years ago, and that has become, in its own unlikely way, one of the things I look forward to most. Sophie and Lucas are careful with each other still. Careful in the way of people who are building something they don't have a template for. Navigating a relationship that has no established conventions because the family that should have connected them never existed in the form it was supposed to. They are half-siblings who met as adults in the aftermath of their shared father's revealed deceptions, and they are making of that what they can, which is more than I had hoped for and perhaps more than either of them expected. The grandchildren have accepted Sophie with the uncomplicated openness of children who have not yet learned to find new people threatening. They call her Sophie. She brings them things from Portland, small interesting objects, a geode, a book about bridges, a puzzle of a map of the world. She is good with them in the direct, unpretentious way of a person who treats children as small people rather than a separate category of being. Thomas would have liked her. That thought arrived one afternoon, and I let it stay rather than pushing it away, because I have stopped treating thoughts about Thomas as things that need to be managed. He was a real person. The love was real. The harm was also real. All of it can exist simultaneously in the understanding of a woman who has had 2 years to practice holding complexity without requiring it to resolve. I booked the flight to Lisbon in February. Not impulsively. I had been looking at flights since the previous March, since the day I sat in the airport coffee shop on the date printed on the unused ticket, and felt something shift from the past tense into something closer to the future. I looked at flights occasionally over the following months, without purchasing, letting the looking be enough until it wasn't. In February, it wasn't enough anymore. I go in June. 10 days. I have a hotel near the waterfront that Catherine recommended when I told her I had finally bought the ticket. She sent me a list of places, neighborhoods, specific streets she had walked in the months since she moved there, written with the insider knowledge of someone who has stopped being a visitor and started belonging to a place. The light in the early morning, she wrote, is unlike anything I have seen anywhere. Go early. Take nothing. Just go. I intend to. There is something I have been trying to find the right words for since I began this story, and I am going to try to say it now. When you discover that someone you loved was not who you believed them to be, the temptation is to conclude that you were foolish, that you should have known, that the signs were there and you missed them because you were naive or inattentive or simply too willing to believe. I want to say clearly that this is wrong. Thomas was not a man who left obvious signs. He was a man who had spent 38 years becoming fluent in the specific language of my trust, and who used that fluency with a precision that had nothing to do with my failure to notice and everything to do with his deliberate effort not to be noticed. You cannot protect yourself against a person who has made a sustained study of how to deceive you specifically. You can only, when the deception is revealed, decide what to do next. What I did next was find out everything. Not because knowledge is comfortable. It isn't, most of the time, but because I have always believed that an accurate understanding of your own life, however painful, is more livable than a comfortable misunderstanding. I wanted to know what was real. All of it. The storage unit and the voicemail, and the wedding album and the daughter in Portland. I wanted the complete picture even when the complete picture was more than I had asked for. I have it now. Or as much of it as I am going to have. And what I know, having it, is this. The truth does not destroy you. It reorganizes you. It takes the materials of your existing life and rearranges them into something that has different proportions, different weight distributions, a different relationship to the light. The process of reorganization is brutal, and it is slow, and there are mornings in the middle of it when you cannot imagine arriving anywhere recognizable. But you arrive. I am 62 years old. I have a garden that came back. A son who is learning to be honest. A daughter I did not know existed who knows good bones when she sees them. For women I understand in the particular way of people who have survived the same storm from different positions. A flight booked to a city I have never seen but am no longer afraid to enter. I have a life. It does not look like the life I believed I was living 2 years ago. It is smaller in some ways and considerably larger in others, and this is the thing I want you to hear, genuinely mine in a way that the previous version, for all its warmth and familiarity, was not entirely. If you have stayed with me through this story, thank you. Genuinely. Leave me a comment, and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever found something you weren't looking for that changed everything. Tell me what you did with what you found. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own reorganization, if you are in the part that feels like an ending rather than a beginning, I want you to know something. The tulips came up. I did not plant them. They were waiting. So are you.